As we continue our march through Torah, we are now nearing the end of Torah, the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And Moses seems to have a lot to convey to the people this week. There are more laws in this Torah portion than in any other. And as Becky wrote beautifully in the intro to the Shabbat email, primarily the laws that we see are about how we are to behave towards each other. Ben Adam lechavero, one human being to the other. We call these particular mitzvot. And some of the examples of the kinds of things that we are told about how we should treat each other and think about each other. If you build a house, you need to build a parapet for your roof so no one will fall from it. You are allowed to eat as many grapes as you'd like from your neighbor's vineyard, but you can't fill a vessel and take them with you. You shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer. You must pay wages on the same day in which they are earned. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. It shall go to the non-Jews, the fatherless, and the widow in your midst. You should not subvert the rights of the stranger or the fatherless, for they are the most vulnerable in your society. And in your business dealings, you shall use honest weights and measures. There are also a whole host of laws about which women are allowed to be sexually involved with which men. We learn that if a man rapes a woman, he pays the bride price to her father and then marries her. But if a man rapes an engaged woman, both are put to death unless the rape occurred within earshot of someone else and the woman cried out. Then only he would be put to death. In the beginning of our Torah portion, Ki Tetzeh, which means when you go out, it's about when the Israelites go to war. Another law about a woman. If you see a beautiful woman who is part of the enemy's people and you desire her, you're allowed to bring her into your home, trim her hair and nails, and after a month in which she has a time to lament losing her family, because she's now in the home of an Israelite, you can marry her. What's common to all these laws about how women are treated? They might have been, in their day, an advance on wanton aggression and lack of boundaries about how to treat a woman. But through our modern lens, it's clear that these laws are lacking because they only consider the needs and the feelings of men. For that is the lens through which the text was probably written. What should we do with these problematic texts? In 1990, the year that I began rabbinic school, there was a foundational text in Jewish feminist thinking called Standing Again at Sinai by Judith Plaskow, in which she opined that in order for us to make this text come alive, for women who have other experiences that the text is not taking into consideration, we need to read the text through the lens of our experience. It's important not to ignore these difficult texts, but to call them out and to continue to interpret them. I have a pastor friend who explained it like this. When asked about the anti-Semitism in the New Testament, shouldn't the New Testament be edited to get rid of that anti-Semitism, someone asked him. And he said no, because every time I read it aloud, I have an opportunity to preach against it. Anti-Semitism still exists in my community, and if I read these texts, I can say why these are problematic, as opposed to if I excise them, that anti-Semitism goes unchecked. So what do we do about these problematic texts? The scenes of desperation in Afghanistan this week, the fear of the Taliban, and many of us know how women were treated under the Taliban. and how primitive texts can be used in a way that can harm others. We need to bring other voices to the text. We need to challenge the text. In our Torah portion this week, we see a lacunae in terms of how women are regarded and enemies are treated. The poor, the orphan, the widow, even the non-Jew are thought about in this week's Torah portion. But what about women? The question we have for ourselves today are, where are our blind spots? Who is not considered in the text of our Torah? Who is not considered in our community? It's easy to criticize the Taliban and religious extremists, but what about in our own lives, in our own communities, when we read these texts? Who's hurt by them? Whose voices need to reflect on them? In our community, we can ask the question about who gets a seat at the table and who's listened to, whose voices are ignored or excluded, who's marginalized. How do we listen to perspectives other than our own, that our identity and life experiences might have a different opinion? Do we assume when we see each other and we talk that everybody in our community, for example, is white, that everybody in our community is heterosexual or cisgender, meaning they identify with the sex with which they were born, that everybody is married? And how does it make people in our community feel if you make these assumptions and this is not their experience? Over the years at Beth Emet, we have been confronted by people who have felt excluded from our community because of the way we have talked, because of our language, because of our life cycle events, perhaps. I remember when I first came to Beth Emet, we would go on retreats to Asrui, and we would advertise those retreats to Asrui as family retreats. And there were single members of our community who came to us and said, if it's a family retreat and I don't have a spouse or children, can I come? Well, of course, I said. Well, why does it say family? That the word family was triggering, and so we changed the language to call them community retreats. Our membership forms used to indicate as if there was one member of the household that would be male and female and that they would be married to each other. But we know that households are varied, that some people live alone, that some people live with a spouse of a different gender or the same gender, that some people live with a sibling or some other family configuration. How do we create membership forms that say, you're included in our community, we're thinking about you? And how do we talk about race in our community? When we say we talk about people who are black or brown, are we exclusively talking about them as if they are outside of our community instead of part of who we are? When we refurbished our building and we put a ramp in, we're saying to people who have physical disabilities, you are welcome here, and we're making it possible for you to come into our sanctuary. When we redid our bathrooms, there was a person who came into our sanctuary who's transgender who said, I feel included here because of your bathrooms. No one had said hello to them, no one had talked to them yet, and they said, but the sign in your bathrooms that shows that those were all gender bathrooms already says something to me about who's included here. A couple of weeks ago, my family and I, we went on a wonderful vacation to Yellowstone. And as we were flying out to Jackson, Wyoming, Danny, my husband, happened to be sitting in the row across from me, and I was sitting next to my son and his boyfriend who were traveling with us. And there was a little girl who was sitting with Danny's row, and her family was sitting somewhere else, and she was 7 years old. And so the two of them struck up a conversation on the plane. And she asked about who was sitting next to him. And Danny said, oh, well, that's my son. And then she said, well, who's sitting next to him? Is that your other son? And Danny said, no, that's not my son. That's my son's boyfriend. Your son's boyfriend, she said. And Danny says, yes, that's my son's boyfriend. She said, well, what, really? Don't boys usually date girls? And Danny said, well, that's often the case, but it's not always the case. And she said, well, that's unusual. Danny says, yes, but people live different kinds of lifestyles, and that's their relationship. Boys can date boys, too. And apparently, the entire flight, they had conversations like this. I don't know what happened at the end of the flight when she went back with her parents, that her eyes were opened to other kinds of experiences. But as we were getting off the plane, the people who were sitting in front of Danny turned around and said, that little girl will remember this conversation forever. How you helped her grow and think about the world in a different and inclusive way, not to make assumptions. This is what it means to really create community and to read our text through various lenses. We always need to be asking ourselves this question: who do we exclude? By our building, by our language, by our posture? Whose feelings are ignored? And most importantly, how do we create a more inclusive community? Our parsha, which teaches how we're supposed to behave, one person towards another, bein adam lechavero. This is really a Torah portion, as they all are, about how we can become more God-infused in the world. That God is right here with us. How we treat each other, how we talk to each other, how we welcome each other. How can we think about others, not make assumptions, and create a richer, more compassionate, and godly community? This is our challenge.